So last but not least, we move to the Middle East, or the Trump administration as seen from the Middle East. We've been through each of the regions and discussed their importance. For the Middle East, there are some of the old favorite reasons and perhaps some new emerging ones that we really should take the time and look at this issue. The classic reason the Middle East is important has always been oil. That's still true, but we need to look at other economic resources as well, and particularly at sovereign wealth funds and investment and global capital markets. There is the conflict issue, the conflict, governance, authoritarian, the refugee issue, which has a direct impact on the European arena that we discussed earlier. There is the Middle East as the source of some of the Islamist ideologies that produce global terrorism, and the repository in ungoverned spaces of those kind of movements. All of these are relevant. The one that's also come up today is the Middle East as a playground for the great powers, which is why we spent so much time in the Russia session talking about Syria. I think that that's very important. If we look at the Syria strike as this defining moment of the new administration, then that makes the Middle East significant. But we also need to see that the Middle East isn't just significant as a playground in instrumental terms, but as an actor. If we take this issue, say, of safe zones, now the announcement just today by President Trump is that he feels he has an agreement on safe zones with the United States in Syria. But it is actually Syrian actors and Syrian dynamics that are going to allow this to happen, or more likely to thwart it. So how the Middle East sees the Trump administration matters, how it reacts matters, what the different, and we're not just talking about state actors here, but what the multiple actors expect affects it. We'll talk about this in different aspects throughout the session, but I want to hand over to our two speakers to introduce the topic in more general terms. On my right, I have Afshin Malavi, who, as always, is explained, his glittering CV is explained in great detail in the booklet, but he's the Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins. On my left, I have Joseph Bahut, who is a visiting fellow at Carnegie and the Middle East program, and formerly a professor of Middle East politics in Paris. Perhaps we could begin with Afshin and talk mostly perhaps about Iran and the Gulf.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. And it's great to be with all of you today. I think this might be my second or third of these kind of panels in the past few weeks when you take a global macro look. And it seems like the Middle East panel is always at the end of the day, maybe because people think you need a stiff drink after, it's just before the cocktail hour, the Middle East panel is. So I was asked to give a sense of how the Trump administration looks from several capitals, the capitals of the Gulf states, the GCC states, and the capital of Iran, Tehran. And so obviously I think everyone in this room understands that you can't essentialize the Gulf states. They have different viewpoints on the Trump administration and different viewpoints on a whole variety of things. In fact, you will find different viewpoints within the Gulf states as well, within a particular Gulf state. But I think if we were to take two of the most consequential actors, we're to look at Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, I think the headline number one would be, thank God he's not Barack Obama, right? The friction between Barack Obama and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi was serious. The friction had roughly three sources, but there were other sources as well. In the post around 2011, when Hosni Mubarak faced an uprising, President Obama said it was time for him to go. This rankled many in Riyadh and rankled many in Abu Dhabi. And particularly if you are King Abdullah, the late king of Saudi Arabia, who had a very close relationship with Hosni Mubarak, this was seen as a supreme act of disloyalty to an ally of the United States. You fast forward a couple of years to the Syria civil war, and the chemical red line had been passed, and it seemed that all the signals to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were that President Obama was going to act, and he sent out Secretary Kerry to give a speech that signaled a military response to the chemical attack, and then he pulled back. It wasn't only the fact that he pulled back from striking, but it was the lack of communication one hears in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. One senior Saudi official said to me, you know, we would have appreciated an email, you know, a fax maybe, even a telex, you know, that you were shifting so dramatically. We had set up our population, we had set up our media, we had set it up that the United States was going to strike at Syria. And my response is that President Obama doesn't really communicate all that well within his own Democratic Party, you know. So you know, you don't take it personally, guys. Then you fast forward to the Iran nuclear deal, which is seen as the ultimate act of mistrust. Not only were there nuclear talks taking place under their nose in fellow Gulf state Muscat, Oman, but President Obama ultimately, it was seen in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi as leveraging U.S. policy towards everything towards this nuclear deal, wanting this nuclear deal so bad that he was putting other issues aside. Again, the view in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. Now you can, you know, if you are a visiting scholar and you visit Riyadh or Abu Dhabi in this period, you would come home, and Judith Kipper might be able to attest to this as one of the great scholars of the Gulf. You will come home your ears ringing, full of why is President Obama doing this, why is he doing that, and very critical. And so issue number one is, you know, thank God he's not President Obama, and that's also issue number 2 and 3. Now, there's a difference. If you are in Doha, Qatar, you might be a little bit worried, partly because of what we're witnessing, a very close relationship emerging between the UAE and the Trump administration. And some of that is personal. Some of that is because the UAE happens to have a very talented ambassador here in Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who is someone who has very well connected on both sides of the aisle. But as soon as President Trump as soon as candidate Trump became President-elect Trump, there were meetings held at Trump Tower between Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince, and Donald Trump. They were brokering all sorts of meetings. There was even the Washington Post reported an attempt to create a back channel between Russia and the United States via Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan on Syria. And so some of that is personal. But if you are Doha, Qatar, you are concerned about this because the UAE likes to whisper behind Qatar's back, likes to say that Qatar supports the Muslim Brotherhood, and you got to watch out for those Qataris. So if you are Qatar, you are a little bit concerned about the closeness of the UAE-Trump relationship. If you are Oman, you may not be actively engaged in you may not be actually engaged in back-channel negotiations on substantive issues like nuclear negotiations, but you may be called upon for hostage negotiations. There are still Iranian Americans held in Iran as virtual hostages. They have a price on their head, and the Omanis are the ones you go to, whether you are Trump or Obama or Hillary Clinton, to help you get their release. Finally, if you are Kuwait, you are trying to get back into the geopolitical game by hosting Yemen peace talks. But ultimately, you are not one of the consequential, serious players in the Gulf that Riyadh and Saudi Arabia and Doha are. And if you are Bahrain, you will follow what Saudi Arabia tells you to do, essentially. If you are Tehran, you should be concerned. You should be concerned because President Barack Obama offered you an opportunity to reintegrate into the global community, offered you an opportunity by expending an enormous amount of political capital in getting the Iran nuclear deal. President Donald Trump, while he may not rip up the Iran nuclear deal as he suggested he would on the campaign trail, he's going to police the Iran nuclear deal with much more vigilance than President Obama might have or a President Hillary Clinton might have done. And some of this is also very personal. If you just look at the people that President Trump has appointed, whether it is Secretary Mattis, the principals at the National Security Council, these are people who, I guess the best way to put it is, when you think of Iran, you think of Javad Zarif, the foreign minister. If you think of President Rouhani, if that's the Iran you think of, that's the kind of the Iran that was thought of when you were in the Obama administration. In the Trump administration, when they think of Iran, they think of Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guard commander. Many of the people within the National Security Council spent a lot of time in Iraq. And they saw their fellow soldiers die at the hands of IEDs provided by the Revolutionary Guard of Iran. This is not a group that will offer any indulgence to Tehran. So if you are Iran, you should be concerned. But the question is which Iran, and this is the last point I'll leave you on, which Iran? Okay, there is, of course, the Rouhani Zarif Iran, which I call Davos Iran. And then there is the Mukhabarat Iran, the Security and Intelligence Services Iran of Qasem Soleimani and Jafari, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, and the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, to some extent, they were not entirely comfortable with this nuclear deal because they were not entirely comfortable with the idea of rapprochement with the United States. What they ultimately wanted was the balance sheet to stop bleeding red because of the sanctions, and then the United States can go about its business, and they can go about their business and have a cold peace. They're not interested in the kind of transparency, the kind of openness that Davos Iran is interested in, the foreign investment that Davos Iran is interested in. They're very happy with their cheap access to cheap credit and licenses and operating in the gray zones of Iran's economy. So the part of the answer is which Iran. And just lastly, I refer you to the Oxford Analytica report in late April. Iran will struggle to create a resistance economy. Friday, April 28th, 2017. I thought it was an excellent report that laid out the struggles that Iran is going to face going forward in its economy. I remember one time I referred to an Oxford Analytica daily brief and I was endorsing it, and then I realized, hey, wait a minute, I wrote that one. This one I did not write, and it's an excellent report. Please.
Thank you. Well, I'll hand straight over to Joseph, and we can carry on with the region and then perhaps narrowing down a bit.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for Oxford Analytica. I'm very happy to be with Afshin here again. In fact, two caveats before I give a kind of global picture of the entire region, including what you said, and I'll overlap very quickly with that. The first caveat is probably all the regions covered today can take this caveat. The foreign policy of the Trump administration, I think, is still under elaboration. I think we are still in the transition period for many, on many aspects and for many reasons. And a lot of very interesting, I won't say flip-flops, but fluctuations are occurring. The mere fact of having today in Washington, D.C., Mahmoud Abbas, for example, in the White House is something no one could have expected, I think, in November or December of last year. So this is the first thing that we have to keep in mind. The second one, which appears very interesting to me, is that probably the amount of expectations from the Arab region, from the Middle East, are much stronger towards Trump than the ones that the Trump administration has towards this region. And under expectation, I put both hopes and fears. So it's a mix of things, and this is what I will try to unpack very quickly. I would say if I take the Middle East as a whole, in a global way, I would maybe divide this region into three categories in terms of their expectations or attitudes toward the Trump administration. I would say there is the group of the countries that you can call the hopefuls, A second group that is the skeptical or the expecting, let's say, and the third one who are the fearful, the wary, the worried, and etc. Under the first one, I would definitely put the hopefuls, the ones that have high expectations. I would put first probably Israel. Bibi's Israel, I mean Netanyahu's Israel. And then I completely agree with you, the United Arab Emirates, and then Egypt, Sisi's Egypt. Under the skeptical, still expecting, trying to decipher, trying to flirt, trying to approach, etc., are the Saudis, definitely. I wouldn't go so far now as to say that they are completely reassured. I will come back to that. And Turkey, which is a very interesting case, that had probably high hopes, maybe with someone like Flynn or etc., but they had hopes, and now they are trying to, or beginning to understand that things will be much more complicated. And then you have the wary, the worried, or the fearful. Of course, Iran, I won't talk about it. Qatar, you said a few words about it, I would say. And people who are, in fact, no more real states, like Syria, like maybe the Palestinian Authority, that is, I mean, Abbas is here, but probably he's here to understand under which fire he will be roasted in a peace process. So these people are trying to maybe hedge their bets. Now, this is the division. Now, what are the issues? What are the stakes? What are the parameters of fears or hope? And here I overlap with what you said. I think that there are at least 4 important files or aspects or questions that will determine hope or fear, that will determine that things will go well or not between the Trump administration and the region. The first one is this entire nexus of, I willingly put these words together, Islam, Islamism, Islamic terrorism, radicalism, Muslim Brothers, and etc. In the Trump's culture, not himself, but the culture of the people around, maybe what I'm saying today is dépassé since Sebastian Gorka has been kicked out of the White House, but there's something grossly speaking about Islam as such, okay, which is a subject of worry for the entire region or a subject of dialogue. The second one is maybe related to it, but not exactly, authoritarianism and strong rules, lack of openness, lack of inclusiveness, etc. I mean, let us say the anti-democracy promotion rhetoric. The third one has to do with Iran and the confrontation with Iran, high expectations or high hope or high fears. And the last one is something that is weighed and really not very well understood in the Gulf yet, which is the potential for a rapprochement with Russia, i.e. a deal with Russia that would either solve a whole set of issues in the region or, on the contrary, be at the expense of a whole set of actors in the region. So you have this kind of matrix, so 3 groups of countries and four issues. Now, if we take this matrix and we try to kick the boxes and to really fill the boxes, it would give something like the following. I would say the Arab Emirates and Egypt kick or tick yes on the 4 issues. They are in agreement with the Trump administration on confrontation Iran confrontation. They are in agreement on the fear of Islamism, Muslim Brothers, and etc. I mean, the mere fact of saying, of looking at the agenda of Sisi's visit to Washington a few weeks ago, there were only 2 headlines: putting the Muslim Brothers on the terrorist list, and then having a limited amount of grants, money, and credits in order to fight the Sinai battle. Iran confrontation, at least for the UAE, verbally is a posture that is non-negotiable. And then authoritarianism, I think you don't need an explanation. Both, in fact, like this kind of cover for a kind of strong rule, especially Sisi in his construction of populism. For Saudi Arabia, things are a bit more nuanced. If you take them one by one, Iran confrontation, yes, definitely. But, however, it will depend on the theater. Saudi Arabia today, and I paraphrase a Saudi decision maker, advisor, not Abdelaziz al-Sagher, who said, Syria is now, we have to admit that it's a lost battle. for Riyadh. Our battle is in Yemen. So if the Trump administration is ready to follow very forcefully on Yemen, like Secretary Mattis has said, the relation will go smooth. Now, remains to see what will be the respective resources, prices, etc., put in this battle. And I think this will be a matter of debate. Interestingly, and here it's a footnote on the flip-flopping of the Trump administration, when Mohammed bin Salman was here in Washington, you could have thought that the honeymoon is very advanced. 2 weeks later, 2 days ago, Trump had a very interesting statement again saying Saudi Arabia is not paying its share of defense in a NATO type of thing. So you could see that Riyadh, when hearing this, could say, okay, we're better off than with Obama, but it's not yet there. I mean, we still have to work on it. And probably the changes within Riyadh are very important on that level. Now, on authoritarianism, lack of democracy, and etc., I think things will go smooth. And last but not least, on Russia, also here things are a bit ambivalent. Because, of course, the Saudis have opened up under the Obama administration to Moscow. But they did it, first of all, in order to unnerve the Obama administration. Second, to hedge their bets in several theaters. But the Saudis are still trying to see what will be Russia's behavior, for example, in Yemen, in Libya maybe, in Syria, even though the Saudis have accepted the defeat. So it's in fact a question mark that is still looming. Now, if you take countries like Qatar, it is even more complicated. So Qatar, I put aside the Kurdish issue, which will be probably the contentious point with the Trump administration, probably more or as much as the Gulen issue, which is in fact a very cosmetic issue for Erdogan. Authoritarianism, it is okay. Iran, it is okay, but because I don't think that the Turks have taken the decision really to confront Iran in Syria and in Iraq, because this would be very costly for them. On a deal with Russia, they are happy because they were precursors. I mean, Erdogan dealt with Putin in a very cynical way after the coup d'etat before the Trump administration came into office. And then you have countries like Qatar and Syria. Qatar very quickly. Iran, yes, but as you said, yes, but with the Emirates, against the Emirate, without the Emirates, besides the Emirate, they want to know what will be their place into that venture. On Islam, this is the real worry, and I think that there are some sentences from the Trump administration that already gave a warning sign to Doha, when they say, for example, that the Muslim Brothers are a source of destabilization in the region. I think Secretary Mattis said it, Secretary Tillerson during his hearing in Congress said it, and also you had lately some op-eds written by think tankers very close to the Trump administration saying Doha should stop supporting terrorism in the region, including Syria, Ahrar al-Sham, and other factions. And then also the deal with Russia is something that is still fluctuant in their mind. I'll end up, because I took a lot of time, on the Syrian issue, because we'll go back to it in the discussion. I agree with you that probably not the tipping point, but the inflection point of the Trump administration towards the Middle East was the Tomahawk strike on the Shairat base. However, and at least for people like me who have Syria as a daily dish, in fact, hopes were very high after the strike. We said, okay, this is what should have had happened in 2013. This is what Obama should have done. And then soon after send a very high-level envoy to Putin and tell him, look, we can do it again. Let's now sit on the table and seriously have a talk about Syria and try to solve it. A lot of things were said during the Russia panel here on that line. However, today, I think, without exaggeration, I would say that this parenthesis is already closed again. So when will be the next blunder by Bashar al-Assad that will go through Donald Trump via Ivanka and the pictures that she will show him that will upset him, and he will decide to do something on Syria? I don't know. And by saying this at the end, I was not only anecdotal, and this would be my closing sentence. I think that some parameter that will be very important for the Trump's foreign policy, essentially in the Middle East, will be the personalized aspect and the very strong or very high probability for volatility and fluctuations.
Thank you both. That's a masterly overview of a very complicated region in a very short time, so I'm extremely grateful. I think I'll draw out very quickly 3 themes, and then I won't use the chair's privilege of asking the first question because I think there will be so many from the floor that it would be cheating, but I would like to highlight the themes that have really struck me in these 2 conversations. Firstly is really the fact that the expectations from the Middle East are so high and so complicated and so focused, and that isn't necessarily reciprocated from the United States and particularly from the Trump administration in Washington, that level of focus and concentration. I think the second theme is the "he's not Obama" argument. And I think it's interesting to think about that because actually that is the perception. That certainly was the perception initially. I think there's an ongoing debate to be had about whether this is a style or a substance issue. Whether he's not Obama rhetorically in terms of volatility, but in terms of what actually happens in real policies as the days go on, which we'll see as the months go on, is that still going to be true? And thirdly, I think it's the sheer complexity of the situation and the fact that we're still in the transition period. The questions are all out there.